All right, Engine Performance Expo viewers, there's the moment you've been waiting for. So we dynoed the engine. We did crack the 1,000 horsepower.
More than 1,000, yeah, pretty easily actually.
Oh yeah, it was like no-brainers. Like a couple of hits, get the tune-up dialed in, and just boom, so there it is.
So you hadn't done a lot of engines before this that were supercharged, I take it?
That'd be zero.
Yeah, so my favorite part of the whole day when we were dynoing is like, we got all that work put into tuning the engine when it was naturally aspirated.
Oh yeah.
And we literally
that was like, normal, right? The normal thrash NA, just chip away, chip away, chip away.
We're getting little chunks here, and then we finally got, what do we make, 657, I think, right?
657, yeah.
So then we like bolt this supercharger on and literally just connect a couple of hoses and pipes, and we slap a belt on there, and I really just took a guess and put a reasonable tune-up in the thing. I open the throttle, we goes, makes a big run, right? And the first number that comes up is 941. And what comes out of the Lake's mouth is, wow, I like turbo. I like supercharging.
Yeah,
you know, boost is
cool.
That was awesome. That was my favorite part of the day. So obviously from there, then we had to tune a little bit.
Yeah.
Right? So no different than any other kind of engine. We just start working on the tune-up of ignition and fuel and stuff like that. But I think this engine has a lot more potential than what we saw. The problem is, we ran into what I consider personal minimums, right? A hard limit that I wasn't willing to push beyond because I don't want to do damage to the engine. But I'd like to share with you guys out there a little bit about how we knew we were getting to the limit. And when I say the limit, there's no problem with the engine. It would gladly make more power.
Yeah, it was giving no signs that it was anywhere near the end. It's like,
not at all.
Keep on going. But the whole Warren axiom, you can't tune it up if you blew it up.
That's right.
So talk about what you saw that kind of said, hey, we need to stop.
Sure, I'd love to share that. So we were not out of blower. We could have easily put on a bigger pulley.
Oh, the big pulley's still on there. Yep. We had just really gotten started.
So sorry, we could have put a smaller pulley on, spin the blower faster. We could have made more boost, more airflow, right? But if the only thing I was looking at,
and you know, I was ready for that too, by the way.
Oh,
I was chomping at the bit to put the small pulley on there and see how much more we were going to make. But then,
well, what I'm going to do is I'm going to pull up over here on the screen. I don't know how well you guys can see the actual detail, but I'll do my best to describe it here. But if the only thing I was really looking at was the power and the torque, and say like my lambda or air-fuel ratio, right? Then everything was fine. No problem, because it hit the target within a very reasonable margin. I wasn't scared of that at all. So if I just looked at that and said, okay, let's put some timing in it, let's do another run, or maybe let's turn the boost up and do another run, it was going to lead to trouble. But let me explain how I can tell that, right? So I want to make sure that people understand that with fuel injection, there's a couple of different things. We have what we call open loop control. We have closed loop control. And then we have long-term trim, or what we call learn. Okay.
Explain that for a little bit. I mean, I have a general understanding of what those three things are, but if you don't happen to know, what is the difference between closed loop and open loop? Okay, so let's identify closed loop and open loop first, then we'll talk about what learn is. So open loop means that I may or may not have an oxygen sensor reading the chemistry in the exhaust. Whether I do or do not has no relevance, though, on the way the computer actually runs the engine, because the computer is running the engine in open loop, meaning it has a given set of parameters, a set program, and it supplies the fuel and the spark to the engine, and it just does that with the trust that the user, me, has put the right numbers in the table. Okay, so I can record that and look after the fact of, oh wow, I missed it a little bit here, or I was way off there, and I can go back and update the program, and we can do another run. So that would be open loop. Okay. Now, because I maybe had an oxygen sensor out there, I'm able to look at the data and see during the run how well my open loop program was controlling the engine. How close it was to what it should be. That's right. My goal or my target versus my actual, right? So even when I go into my data logger on the ECU here, which I'll pull up for you guys, and again, I don't know how well you'll be able to see it, but I'll explain. I have a line that goes across the table here that shows me any point in the run what the goal was, what the target was, right? And then I have another line that plots out what the actual result was. So I have my target and I have my actual, and as long as they're the same, I'm good with that, right? However, as a tuner, what I want to know is, how did that happen? So in other words, did my actual air-fuel ratio match the target simply because I'm a wizard and I had a magic tune-up that my open-loop calibration was perfect for the engine? That would be great. It's not always the case. Or did it do it because the ECU was helping me? And by helping me, I mean it's in closed-loop mode. So what that means is,
We take our open loop calibration, we send it to the engine, but the instant that the O2 sensor reads that it's not matching the target, the computer updates the calibration and says, well, wait a minute, let me help you out here a little bit. Within limits, I can add this much or take this much away to try to get you to your target. So again, if the only thing that I was looking at was whether or not my actual lambda or air-fuel ratio met the target, I could still be missing some of the picture. So what I've seen here is all the way throughout our run, right until we get to about 7,000 RPM, everything's hunky-dory. Then I can
target and the actuals right on spec, and there's very little interference.
Correct. Not only were they on spec, but it wasn't happening because of the extra closed loop. So I had -1, +1, +2 or 3. You know, within a, let's say plus or minus 5%, you're probably going to be really safe there, right? If the exhaust was to fail or the O2 sensor died or whatever, the car's probably going to keep running. If we start getting way out of that, we need to ask ourselves why, right? But what I noticed was that right about 7,000 RPM, suddenly there was a divergence between what my actual air-fuel ratio was and what my target was. I was no longer able to keep them the same, and I noticed that exactly at the same moment that happened, the amount of correction from the closed loop that I was getting was increasing. So in other words, it was saying, hey, you're not supplying enough fuel, I'm going to do it for you. Now, at some point, the closed loop control actually came up and it leveled off, and it said, that's all I'm going to add. Well, the reason that it did that is that in my program, in my calibration, I had set a ceiling, a limit. In this case, it was a pretty big limit, 75% from closed loop.
Okay, so 75% extra.
In addition to what was in the table. So that means either my table's got to be wrong by 75% or something else was happening, right? So now I'm starting to think, okay, what's going on here, right? So the next thing I wanted to look at was the long-term trim, which is what we call learn. So the goal of closed loop control is to reduce the amount of error between your actual and target air-fuel ratio, okay? And it will continue to add closed loop control until one of two things happens. Either the error goes away or it reaches its limit, okay? But in any case, the goal of the learn or the long-term trim is to reduce the amount of closed loop that we need. Because over time, I would say, well, every time you go to XYZ, every time you go to, say, 5,000 or 7,000 or 8,000 RPM, I can see that every time you go there, you're adding, 21% of correction. So my learn is going to say, all right, I'm just going to preemptively load that 21% in there. So you're not relying on the O2 sensor, right? And so that gets stored in a long-term memory that doesn't go away when you turn off the key. The next time you start the engine, that will still be there. With the idea of now we don't rely on the closed loop.
Anyone that's ever plugged in an OB2 reader and
has
paged over
short and long-term trims. That's right. So that's essentially what's going on there, right? But what I noticed is that even though my closed loop had pegged at 75%, my learn was counting up as well. In fact, it had a hard ceiling of 30%, and it got all the way to 29.
It's almost there.
So we're talking about 104% of correction. So literally, I was asking for twice as much fuel as what was in my normal table. Now,
so that should mean it should be way rich then.
It should be crazy rich, right? But instead, it was not even on target. It was slightly lean of the target, even by doubling that pulse width. So
and now this is the important part. Listen up.
So now I've screwed up some tune-ups in my time, I promise. But usually I don't miss by 100%.
He didn't miss on this one, right? It didn't magically go that lean.
From 7,000 RPM to 8,000.
That little window just didn't all of a sudden become a whole new engine.
That's correct.
So something else was going on. So
that's right. So what I will typically do then is I want to ask, well, what is the fuel flow, Mr. ECU, that you think you were giving, right? So what I'm going to do is I'm going to compare the fuel flow numbers that I had originally put in my open loop calibration. I'm going to compare that to what it said I was giving after all of my extra help from the O2 sensor, right? So when I look on here, I've got just a hair under 600 pounds per hour of fuel flow. About 593 or something like that, right? Depends on which little box I look at, but just to round numbers, we'll call it 600. Now, when I go over here to my dyno, I can look at what the measured fuel flow actually was. Okay, so let's take a look. So I'm going to go over here to fuel flow, and I can see that at that RPM, it says that I had 600, let's see, I'm at, there we go, get about the same RPM, 629 pounds per hour fuel. That's a pretty reasonable match, within about 3 or 4 or 5%, right? The problem is, when I look down here at what the actual fuel flow the ECU believes it was delivering, it thinks it was 1,107.
Problem.
which is actually getting close to being about double what the base number was.
Here that 104 again.
Yeah, 592 up to 1100. We're getting real close to that value, right? So that's why I know there's a serious problem. The ECU believes that it's actually supplying that much fuel, but it's not.
Right.
The thing is, the ECU doesn't know what the engine's fuel pressure is.
Right.
So we go over to our dyno, and we'll take a look at fuel pressure, and suddenly we can see that it holds all the way across the run until about that 7,000 RPM, and then it takes a dive and starts going downhill.
Right.
So now I know what's happening is the fuel system in the dyno room is not keeping up with the demands of the engine. So you can have closed loop control.
Right.
You can open the injectors longer. You can open the injectors all day long, but if you don't have any fuel pressure, they are not going to supply extra fuel to the engine. But
and why is that? Because there's a physical property here. Just because I open that injector, why will it not move more fuel?
Well, you have to have a difference in pressure across the injector to make it flow. Think about the way your engine works. You got to have a difference in pressure to make airflow move through the engine. So your fuel injector is no different.
Right.
And so what's happening is, I'm going to use this spark plug since I don't have an injector sitting next to me. Let's pretend that this was a fuel injector.
Sure.
Okay? So I'm going to have fuel pressure up here. Let's say I started with 60 psi. Okay. So if I have 60 psi fuel pressure and I spray fuel out the bottom, however long you hold that open, that's how much fuel is going to come out.
Right.
Okay, but if I was to add 10 pounds of boost to my engine, I'd have 70 pounds here, and I'd have 10 here.
Right.
So the net difference across that injector would only be 60. So suddenly my fuel injector, for the same amount of open time, is going to flow less fuel.
Right.
So with my boost here and my fuel pressure out there dropping, the situation gets really out of control in a hurry. Right? So I could see, if I was only looking at airflow ratio, I would have been like, everything's great, keep going. But since I could see a huge discrepancy between the desired fuel flow and what the ECU thought the fuel flow was, I had to go, wait a minute, what's happening? And I could see that because my closed loop correction was going through the roof and my learn was trying to get the closed loop and it couldn't. So in other words, the ECU was trying to help me, but it couldn't because no matter what it did, we didn't have any fuel pressure.
It was at the limit of the pump.
That's right. The pump and the lines and whatever your system is. That
the fuel
was the
flow
indicator.
supply, we tapped out. We got the limit.
That's right.
We could have maybe done a few little workarounds, like if it's the last round or the last race of the year.
A number of tricks that I could have done to fix it up and band-aid
to maybe make one more hit.
For sure.
But the reality is, if we had tried to go further, now we're in the danger zone.
Absolutely.
And we're back to, hey, you may have made the big giant number, or you may have had a big hole in your piston.
Might make less, right? Yeah. So I just felt like for us, the end goal wasn't necessarily how much power could we make out of this engine. It was really what could we learn and what could we teach from it.
Right.
And so one of the most teachable lessons is we have to look at all of the information, not just one piece, right? If I had only looked at air fuel ratio, I'd have been like, hey, high five, this is wonderful, let's keep going. But it would not be very long after that we would run into serious trouble. And so we decided that 1,046 horsepower was going to be the number for revision 1 on this engine. Well, technically it's revision 2, right? Because we made 657 on revision 1 naturally aspirated. And spent a half a day bolting some tubes on and falling out of a tree easy. It made 1,046, right?
Some hose clamps and some stuff, and next thing you know, boom.
Yeah, we added 400 horsepower.
That's pretty easy.
Yeah, so I think we're going to stop there to protect the engine.
Yeah.
We'll upgrade the fuel system on the dyno, and then we'll come back with maybe trying some different pulleys. We could make some changes to the engine as far as airflow, camshaft, headers, intakes, whatever.
We learned a lot of stuff yesterday playing around, getting it to this point.
Absolutely.
So that's why you got to tune in for the next Engine Performance Expo.
You just set the hook, didn't you?
Yeah, because it's the cliffhanger.
Yeah.
So we got this far. We're not even close to being done yet. This is not the end. This is just the beginning. And
we're only done for today, right?
We're only done for today. So with that, we'll throw it back to Joe Costello.
See you, buddy.
What a day, what a day, what a day. My brain is swollen. I've learned so much today. They told us, don't start cars. We are not going to listen.